The third interview of Dr. Jamission Neruda. By Sarah.
What follows is a session I recorded of Dr. Neruda on December 30, 1997. He gave permission for me to record his answers to my questions. This is the transcript of that session. This was one of 5 times I was able to tape record our conversations. I have preserved these transcripts precisely as they occurred. No editing was performed, and I've tried my best to include the exact words, phrasing, and grammar used by Dr. Neruda. It's recommended that you read the December 27 and December 28, 1997 interviews before reading this one. Good evening, Dr. Neruda. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready when you are.
One of the things that I find hard to embrace about this whole affair is that the concept of time travel always seemed like a fairly easy technology to develop. I know I've gotten that impression from Star Trek and various other movies and television, but still, what you've described seems like it's so difficult to develop that we'll never succeed. Is it really that hard to develop?
The way time travel is presented in the movies trivializes the complexities of this technology, and interactive time travel or BST, as defined by 15, is the most sophisticated of all technologies. It's the apex technology from which virtually all other technologies can be derived. So, in creating BST, one is creating a shortcut or an accelerated pathway into the acquisition of virtually all other technologies. This is why BST is so difficult to develop. Science fiction violates most of the scientific premises that are related to our understanding of time travel. And BST in particular is an extremely sophisticated application of scientific principles that are simply not stated in science fiction, mostly because people like the effects and plot lines of time travel, more than they have an appetite for understanding the science behind it. So writers, especially for television and movies, trivialize the degree of complexity that surrounds this apex technology.
But you didn't really answer my question. Will we succeed in developing it?
There's little doubt in my mind that the Labyrinth Group will succeed in developing BST. The question is, whether it's in humanity's best interest in the long term. They were weeks from beginning their initial tests for broad-scale testing just before I defected. There was widespread anticipation at the director level that BST was a matter of 4 to 6 months away from a successful test.
So what's the biggest obstacle to success?
Simply stated, it's whether the Labyrinth Group has the ability to define and access intervention points as prescribed by 15 that have the least impact on related events in horizontal time. It's the most subtle, yet most important component to this whole chain of technologies.
Can you explain this in lay terms?
It's an extremely difficult technology to develop. Defining the optimal intervention point, accessing the intervention point, and returning from the intervention point, without detection. This is all about splicing time at the causal level with a minimum of disruption. It's the equivalent challenge of throwing a boulder into a pond without any ripples.
Why all the concern about minimizing disruption? I mean, in the case of the Animus, aren't they trying to completely annihilate humankind? Why should we care so much about disrupting their way of life?
First of all, the Animus are not coming to annihilate humankind. They're coming to control the genetic library, known as Earth. Their intention is not completely understood, but it's not to kill our animal populations or the human species. It has more to do with genetic engineering and how their species can be modified to enable it to house a spiritual consciousness. They want unfettered access to our DNA in order to conduct experiments. Beyond this, they want to colonize Earth, but for what ultimate purpose, we don't know. To your question, the concern about minimizing impacts from BST intervention has to do as much with selfish interests as altruistic ones. When events are altered or changed, they can have unintended and very unpredictable consequences. For example, we could successfully divert the Animus from our galaxy, but in the process, unintentionally send them to another planet. This act would have consequences to our planet that we could never predict.
Are you talking about karma?
No. It has to do with physics and the inherent nature of complex systems. Causal energy is eternal. It simply bounces from event to event. In some cases, it shapes the event, in others, it creates the event. Causal energy is the most potent force in the universe, and when it's redirected on a global scale it will rebound in unpredictable and innumerable ways.
So, this is the flaw of BST. not knowing the consequences of changing events? Are you suggesting that we could succeed in diverting the animus from our planet, and then some years later fall victim to some other form of catastrophe that wipes out our planet?
No, it doesn't happen quite like that. The energy system that was redirected would simply rebound to the point from whence it was redirected. How it would rebound is so complex that it would be impossible to predict the nature of its reaction. I suppose it could invite a cataclysm of some kind, but it's not to say humanity would be punished, if that's what you're trying to imply.
I guess that's what I was implying. But isn't it true that karma exists? And if we turned the animus onto another planet via BST, we'd be setting ourselves up for a negative reaction?
No. It means we'd receive a reaction, and the nature of the reaction may be so unrelated to the causal energy redirect that no one would know it was a reaction. This is the nature of causal energy. It rebounds of its own force and intelligence. It's not a simple reaction to an action.
I thought karma, and even physics, held that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. What happened to this principle?
It's alive and well. It just doesn't apply to causal energy systems or the dimension of vertical time.
Okay, I'm going to avoid another discussion of physics in favor of finding out why you think BST will succeed given our discussion of the past few minutes.
It's one of the main reasons I defected.
How do you mean that?
This issue of uncertainty, regarding causal energy systems, has always been the breaking point of BST, at least theoretically. 15 believes he knows how to manage this. I'm not so certain it can be managed, particularly after my exposure to the Wingmakers and gaining a bit of understanding into their solution in dealing with the animus.
I know you've talked a little bit about this already, but refresh my memory. What is their solution?
I have only a few pieces to go by, so I'm not going to be able to talk definitively about this.
And what's the nature of these sources?
There was an RV session that elicited some insight. I read more about it in the introduction of the text from the optical disc.
This being the text that literally disappeared.
Yes, but I've stored the entire text in my memory.
Anything else?
I had a direct communication with what I believe was a representative of the Wingmakers.
How? When?
It's a complicated story, but Samantha, the RV assigned to our project, was having increasingly strong connections to the Wingmakers. Unfortunately, they were so strong that 15 had little choice but to subject her to an MRP. I met with her just prior to the procedure, and she suddenly began channeling a presence to me that I believe was from the central race.
And from these three sources you have a pretty good idea as to how the Wingmakers plan to protect their genetic library?
Correct.
And what did this channeled entity say?
Its primary emphasis was that our technology would fail us.
And by technology, it meant BST?
That was my interpretation.
So you trust this Samantha?
I have no doubts about her whatsoever. She was simply our best RV, and quite possibly the best natural intuitive we ever had within the ACO.
Let's go back to something you implied a minute ago. Did I understand you right that you defected from the ACO because of a disagreement you had with 15 about BST and the Wingmakers' solution of defense?
Yes. It was a primary factor.
Can you elaborate on this a bit?
15 believed that Samantha, our RV, could jeopardize our mission because of her ability to make contact with the Wingmakers. In 2 of the 3 RV sessions she performed, they detected her presence, and they had begun to probe her. 15, once he had confirmation that these beings were, in all probability, from the central race, became quite alarmed and put a stop to any further RV sessions. When I asked him why, he seemed to have some apprehension about their ability to sense our work on BST, and feared that they may put an end to it.
Why?
Because they are very powerful beings. What most people consider God, amplify by a factor of 1,000 and you would be close to the range of capabilities and power that these beings can wield.
Are you saying these beings are more powerful than God?
The problem with your question is that I don't know which God you're referring to. The conception of God in the Bible, or most of our planet's holy books, bears no resemblance to the image of God that I hold in my mind.
Okay, I want to come back to this topic because it really holds an interest to me, but I also want to complete our discussion around your defection. Can you explain what happened?
Simply put, I began to feel that the defensive weapon installed on this planet by the Wingmakers stood a better chance of succeeding than BST. All logic dictated this to be true. 15, however, disagreed. He would allow further investigation into how to find the remaining Wingmakers sites and how to bring them online, but he would never share the technology or anything related to the discovery with the general public.
And so your differences over this issue caused your defection?
Yes.
Back to the topic of God. Tell me how your version of God is defined.
God is a unifying force, primal and eternal. This force is the original force that summoned life from itself to become both its companion and journey. The life that was summoned was experimented with many times until a soul carrier was formed that could take a particle of this force into the outer, expanding universes.
I assume this soul carrier you're referring to is the central race?
Correct.
Are these the same as angels?
No, the central race is more akin to genetic planners and universe architects. They're not well known or understood, even in the most insightful cosmologies held by the core team.
So, I presume if angels are real, they're yet another creation of the central race?
Correct.
Then God, or this force as you were describing it, didn't really create anything other than the central race, and then return to his abode in the center of the universe? It sounds like the central race does all the work.
The central race is simply a time-shifted version of the human race.
Huh?
The central race holds the genetic archetype of the human species, no matter what form it takes on, no matter what time it lives in, no matter what part of the universe it lives in. This archetype is like a magnetic force, it draws the lesser developed versions of the species towards it. All versions of the humanoid species are merely time-shifted versions of the central race, or at least that's the view of the core team.
Stop a second. Are you saying that I'm made from the same DNA as the central race? That I'm essentially the same, genetically speaking, just in a different time and space? How's that possible?
It's possible because the central race designed it that way. DNA is not something that only transmits physical characteristics or predispositions. It transmits our concepts of time, space, energy, and matter. It transmits our conscious and unconscious filters. It transmits our receptivity to the inward impulse of original thought, and this receptivity is what defines the motion of the being.
The motion of the being?
All beings are in motion. They're going somewhere every moment of their lives. If not physically in motion, their minds are in motion. Their subconscious is always in motion, interacting with the data stream of a multiverse. The motion of the being is simply a term we used at the ACO to define the internal compass.
And the internal compass is?
It's the radar system of the individual that defines its path through life at both their macroscopic and microscopic levels, and everywhere in between.
I have this feeling that this topic could go on forever.
It's not that complex, Sarah. Think of the decisions you make in your life. Which ones would you say were made for you by external sources, which ones were your own, and which ones were a combination of both external and your own decision?
You mean as a percentage?
Try to estimate.
It depends on what stage of my life I consider. When I was a baby, my parents made all my decisions.
No, this applies to all stages from birth to death. Just make a guess.
I don't know, maybe 40% external, 30% my own, and 30% a combination.
Then you'd be surprised if I told you that you deposit an image within your DNA before you're born that defines your motion of being. And when this deposit is made, your motion of being is defined by you, not someone else. No external force makes your decision, an external force can only inform and activate a decision already made.
You lost me. Are you saying that every decision in my life was already made before I was born?
No. Every causal decision was.
So what's the difference between a causal decision and a regular decision?
Think of how many decisions you make in a day. Wouldn't you agree that it's probably hundreds if not thousands every day? These are, as you put it, regular decisions. Causal decisions are defined by how integral they are to the substrate of the individual being. Are you receptive to new ideas? Are you able to synthesize opposing thoughts? Do you process information dominantly in a visual or numeric context? These are causal decisions that you define before being born, and they're encoded within the DNA that activates your decision matrix. External forces like parents, teachers, and friends only inform you of what you've already defined as the motion of your being.
Is this according to the core TM, too?
This is part of the learning I personally gathered from my own experiences. The core team subscribe to a similar belief, however.
You're telling me a variation of reincarnation, aren't you? When you said that we deposit an image within our DNA before we're born, who exactly does the depositing?
Only the formless consciousness can deposit an image onto the DNA template.
I assume you're talking about soul?
It depends again on your definition of soul. The formless consciousness is that which observes and experiences through forms or structures, not just physical embodiments. For example, consciousness can be contained inside a structure or form, but not be physically based. The mind is such a structure. While it's not physical, consciousness, when physically embodied, peers through a mind structure like someone looking through a window. Soul is often confused with the mind and vice versa. The formless consciousness is that particle of God that is decelerated from the frequency of the God state, into individuality, where it can become autonomous and exercise free will. Think of it like a photon, or subatomic particle that is cast into a web of interconnected particles of like-mindedness. That is to say, all the particles have a similar frequency, or spin rate, and they're able to step down their frequency, at will, in order to enter membranes of consciousness that can only be entered by taking on a form. So the formless becomes form, and just before it enters the body, consciousness activates the DNA template according to its desired experiences within the membrane of reality it chooses.
What do you mean by the term membrane?
The multiverse is a collection of reality membranes, clustered together in a dimensional matrix that responds to the thought circuits and gravity fields of our formless consciousness. We've been trained, through evolutionary timescales, to accept the three-dimensional world as our reality. These reality membranes are not structured like parallel planes or rungs of a ladder, but rather are like lattices of interlocking cells. If you want, I can describe them in more detail, but I think it becomes so abstract from here forward that I suspect your eyes will glaze over.
All of this seems unbelievable. I'm beginning to wonder if you're the reincarnation of Jesus or Buddha.
I'm reincarnated, and that's as far as I can attest.
Do you remember any of your previous incarnations?
Previous is a relative term. I prefer to think of my incarnations not so much as a function of memory, but something more akin to a bleed-through of a simultaneous reality membrane. The compartments into which human experience is divided are not so watertight that they exclude one life from entering, or influencing, another. And from my experience, these compartments represent parallel moments in the life of an individual across a broad sweep of time and space.
So you're implying that our past, present, and future lives are all lived out at the same time, even though they seem to be taking place in different places and times?
Yes.
Okay, then explain how it's possible, because it doesn't make any sense to me.
Our formless consciousness is like a sphere with many, many spokes leading outwards from its central core. Each of these spokes connects into the vertical time continuum through forms, and these forms, human or otherwise, feed the formless consciousness with insights about the different reality membranes in which it has form. In this way, the forms of the formless bring it awareness of different reality membranes, which in turn is processed by the formless and passed on through the unification force to God.
God's the recipient of all this information or experience? From every living thing? From every time and place? How?
I don't have any idea.
But this is what you believe, and I have to assume you wouldn't believe it if you didn't have some evidence to support your belief.
Sometimes you follow a trail of evidence to a point where it comes to an abrupt end, but you can still imagine how the trail continues despite the lack of proof that it moves forward in a particular direction. You can intuit its pathway. Call it imagination or pure conjecture, I don't care. But it's what I've done in this case. I truly don't know how this magnitude of data could possibly be processed for any useful purpose, but I believe it.
Okay, give me a second to review my notes. Because I want to go back to something you said earlier. Here it is. You said that everyone defines his or her motion of being at the causal level. If that's the case, and assuming that soul is intelligent, why would any soul choose to be impaired mentally, emotionally, or physically?
How do you mean that?
Let's say that soul entered a body, but chose to be closed-minded, stupid, and generally a blob. Why would an intelligent consciousness choose this and then imprint it on their DNA so their life is made more difficult, or at least more boring?
Let me ask you a question. Why would God impose this same condition on a person?
But you're starting with the assumption that God exists.
Make this assumption and then answer my question.
I know what you're implying, but why would either God or soul impose these, at least from my point of view, stupid decisions?
It has to do with complex systems and their inherent rules of dynamics.
Could you be a bit more specific?
In order to expand and ultimately support diverse life forms, the universe required an incalculably complex system of interrelated principles and rules. The more complex this system is, the more dynamic are its poles of interaction. Think of it like an uncut diamond. When you shine a focused beam of light on it in a dark room, there's only a muted glow, but if you facet the diamond, making it more complex, it spreads light in a radiant pattern upon all the walls of the room. Complexity works in a similar manner with consciousness. It facets human experience and spreads the light of consciousness upon all the walls of experience, including ignorance, stupidity, wickedness, beauty, goodness, and every other possible condition of human experience. The formless consciousness is not stupid in choosing to experience something that we might deem difficult or boring. It's simply acknowledging that the reality membrane of Earth requires it. No one can live within this reality membrane and be untouched by the dynamics of the human experience. No, one's exempt from difficulties or pain. Does that prove that every one of us makes stupid decisions? No, it only proves that we live within a complex world. That and nothing more.
Not to sound defensive, but you'd agree that some have easier lives than others.
Yes, but it's not relevant to the intelligence of the formless consciousness.
Okay. So is it related to the age of the formless consciousness?
Are you asking if the formless consciousness, as it gains experience, becomes better at selecting its motion of being?
Exactly.
The formless consciousness looks upon hardship and ease, the way you might look upon the negative and positive ends of a battery. With relative indifference, I would imagine.
There's no difference, is that what you're saying? No value to being an Einstein versus a Hitler? I don't believe that.
The choice is not made to be evil or wicked, or to select a life path that is excruciatingly difficult for oneself and others. Nor, in the case of Einstein, did he choose to contribute to humanity's understanding in a way that permitted the creation of nuclear weapons. In the formless consciousness of these individuals, prior to their most recent incarnations, they didn't make choices to harm or help humanity. They made choices to experience aspects of this reality membrane that would contribute to their own understanding.
So, you're saying that the soul chooses its motion of being according to its selfish desires? It doesn't think about the greater good at all?
It doesn't need to think about the greater good. That's what the unification force does.
It's an interesting philosophy. We can be as selfish as we desire, and leave it up to God to make our selfish, clumsy actions into something that contributes to the common good of humanity. Is that what you're really saying?
No. I'm saying that God, working through its unification force, orchestrates the intermingling of life in order to bring about transformation in the universe. God is like the cosmological alchemist who transforms the selfish interests of the one into the transformative conditions for the many.
Then you're saying that God solves all of our human frailties. We can do anything and it doesn't really matter because he'll fix it. If this philosophy were taught in our world, we'd be in sorry shape.
While it may not be taught in a formal way, humankind is unconsciously aware that this is the way it works.
On this point, I have to disagree with you. Selfish interests, evil intent, stupidity. These are not the traits of a responsible society, and I don't know of anyone who believes that we should act in this way and then let God perform damage control or mop up after our poor judgments.
You misunderstand. Perhaps I'm not explaining this very well. Let me try again. First, the selfish interests of the formless consciousness are to facet its consciousness in such a way that it can receive and radiate the unification force. In so doing, it can become consciously connected to this force and knowingly become a conduit for it into a broad range of reality membranes. Now, The formless consciousness selects reality membranes to enable the passing of its consciousness. None of this is done with an attitude of universal contribution or noble purpose. However, this isn't a result of selfish behavior as you think of it. It's a result of its nature. The way it was designed. I'm not saying that God cleans up after our messy mistakes. I'm saying our messy mistakes are not messy mistakes. Again, we live in a complex system of interdependent reality membranes. You can think of these membranes like scales on a snake, and the snake represents the collective human consciousness. Each scale protects the human soul and, collectively, propels it through its environment, in this case, the multiverse. The messy mistakes that we individually and collectively make are as responsible for the existence of the multiverse as are the noble contributions.
Let me see if I got this right. You're saying that our mistakes, both as individuals and as species, make it possible for us to exist, so, therefore, they're not mistakes?
As I said earlier, complex systems require a near-infinite range of dynamics in order to sustain the system. Our reality membrane is form-fitted to the complexity of our universe, which in turn created the environment of Earth and its various life forms. Yes, our mistakes, our individuality, is a central part of our ability as a species to sustain itself in the face of a complex, interconnected structure of the quantum world and the cosmos. The selfish motivations harvest the experience that facets our consciousness, which in turn are harvested by the unification force and used to transform reality membranes into passages through which a species can return to the God state. The mistakes weigh equally in this process, as do the unselfish contributions. Nothing is wasted.
If this is all true, why even worry about the animus or anything else? Just let God take care of everything.
Because the animus are not connected to the unification force.
Why? I thought you said everything was.
The formless consciousness doesn't select soul carriers that don't utilize DNA as its formative structure. It knows that these structures are not able to connect to the unification force, and therefore, cannot be trusted.
And they can't be trusted because?
Because the unification force is what brings coherence to incoherence, and purpose to chaos. Without it, physical structures tend to ebb and flow in stasis, which is to say, they don't transform.
How did this happen?
What?
That the animus became an independent race unconnected to God?
You've heard the story of the fallen angels?
You're talking about the Lucifer rebellion?
Yes. This story is misrepresented in biblical texts, owing to the fact that the authors of these texts didn't have a sufficient understanding in which to define cosmology or physics. The central race designed the higher life forms, and this includes a wide range of beings that operate within the quantum world and the reality membranes therein. Among these beings are what we commonly refer to as the angels, who are intermediaries between the soul carriers of humanoids, and the central race. There were some within the angelic realm that believed the central race was too controlling of the soul carrier structure. They felt that a structure should be created that would enable angels to incarnate within the reality membrane of Earth and other life-bearing planets. They insisted that this would improve these planets and the physical structure of the universe at large. However, the central race refused this proposal and a renegade group left to design a soul carrier, independent of the central race.
Hold on a moment. You're saying that Lucifer led this rebellion to create a soul carrier that could house the spirit of an angel, and the animus are the result?
It's more complicated than that. Lucifer, or what we have come to call Lucifer, was a very devoted servant of the central race. He was one of the forerunners of the angelic species, capable of powers that were diminished by the central race in subsequent prototypes.
Are you saying that angels are created? That they can't reproduce like humans?
Correct. Lucifer's personality included a strong sense of independence from his creators, and an even stronger sense that his creators were flawed because of their insistence that the humanoid soul carrier would exclusively house the formless consciousness, and not the angelic form. To Lucifer, this seemed unthinkable because the angelic form was superior in its capabilities and could be of great assistance to the physical life forms on Earth and other life-bearing planets. From Lucifer's perspective, Humans and the higher order species would be unable to transform themselves because of the severe limits of their soul carriers, or physical forms. Lucifer felt certain that without the collaboration of the angels, humanoids throughout the universe would become increasingly separated from their purpose as spiritual beings, and throw the universe into disarray, which would eventually cause its destruction and life within it, including, of course, angels.
Then you're suggesting that the Lucifer rebellion was simply a disagreement over this one issue.
Lucifer wanted to incarnate into this reality membrane the same way humans do. He wanted to become a collaborator with humanity to assure its ascension. While the Central race saw his intentions as noble, they feared that the angelic incarnations would become known as gods to their human counterparts, and unintentionally mislead humans, rather than co-create the ladder to the god state. This matter underwent a tremendous debate, ultimately forming a division between the angelic realm and the Central race. The loyalists to the Central race argued that Lucifer and his sympathizers should be banished for their radical ideas that could potentially create a lasting division in their reality membrane, and cause them tremendous turmoil. Lucifer, in wide-ranging deliberations with the Central race, negotiated a compromise that enabled him to take his group of sympathizers and prove the value of their plan on a single planet.
Are you saying that Lucifer was allowed to experiment on a planet?
Yes.
Okay, before we go any further, are you talking about this in the context of myth, or are you essentially representing the core team view?
There are 3 ancient manuscripts in the ACO's possession that describe this story in an allegorical form, but the core team view, as you put it, is much more descriptive and definitive as a record of this cosmic event.
So, Lucifer conducted this experiment. Where, and to what result?
The planet is in a galaxy known as M51 to your scientists.
This is the same galaxy of the Animus.
Yes.
So you're really saying that Lucifer and his band of sympathizers created the Animus to be soul carriers for angels?
It's more complicated than that.
I certainly hope so, because this story is too strange for me to believe.
Be patient. We're moving into uncomfortable territory for most people. So take a deep breath and bear with me as I try to explain this. Lucifer created a synthetic physical structure that could accommodate the quantum requirements of an angel. It was a very effective structure, but induced a strong survival complex within the species, which eventually overpowered the angelic tendency of altruism and cooperation.
Why? What happened?
When the formless consciousness enters a reality membrane through a structure like a soul carrier, it immediately feels disconnected from all other forces, but its own. It's literally thrown into separation. In humans, this is more or less controlled through the subtle realization that it remains connected through the unification force, and this is because its DNA is designed to emit this feeling of connection subconsciously. However, in the case of the soul carrier designed by Lucifer and his followers, this connection was severed both consciously and subconsciously because the structure was not based on DNA, which is strictly controlled by the Central race. Consequently, it inclined this experimental species toward a very strong survival complex because it feared extinction so deeply, which is the result of feeling complete separation from the unification force. This survival complex created a species that overcompensated its fear of extinction by developing a very powerful group mind. The group mind compensated for the loss of connection to the unification force, creating its physical and mental corollary. It was the equivalent of unifying the species as a whole in the physical reality membrane of their planetary system. Thus, the angels that entered this system lost their memory of their angelic natures and became more interested in operating as a single collective, than as individuals. They became a concern for the Central race, and Lucifer was asked to dismantle his experiment. However, Lucifer had become attached to the species that he had helped to create. These angelic beings had developed over a number of generations a very sophisticated set of technologies, culture, and social order. It was like an extended family in many ways to Lucifer. So, he negotiated to modify his creation so they would no longer accommodate the angelic frequency or quantum structure, but that they could become self-animated.
How do you mean self-animated?
That they would become soulless androids.
And so this happened, and that's how we got the Animus.
Yes.
It doesn't make any sense. Why would God, or the central race for that matter, allow Lucifer to create a race of androids? Didn't they know that these beings were going to become the scourge of our universe?
Yes, of course they knew. However, God doesn't design something as complex as the multiverse, and then control how everything operates.
But you said earlier that God orchestrates what happens through the unification force.
God orchestrates how the dynamics of the multiverse come together to form a unified, comprehensible data stream that can inform the next evolution of the multiverse. Most people would think that an all-powerful God would banish a species like the Animus, but it doesn't work this way because the dark side of predation, as in the case of the Animus, sparks resourcefulness and innovation in its intended prey.
And with a prey,
not just us, but the humanoid species as a whole.
Evil begets good. That's what you're really saying, right?
Again, it's not evil against good. The Animus don't consider themselves to be evildoers when they invade a planet. From their perspective, they are simply executing their plan to become reconnected to their sense of individuality and become, as strange as it may sound, more spiritual.
But when I asked you earlier if you knew what their intentions were with Earth, you said you didn't know.
I don't. However, I do know something about their intentions to re-engineer their soul carriers to be more DNA compliant. They want to introduce DNA to their soul carriers in order to transform their species. This is essentially what any race would do under their exact set of circumstances. In fact, you could even call it noble.
Noble? I don't see anything noble in trying to commandeer our planet and subject our citizens to genetic experiments and tyranny.
To us, no. But from a completely objective viewpoint, one can appreciate that the Animus are just trying to transform their species for the better. They don't have any other choice because without DNA, they're simply unable to connect to the unification force.
Why can't they contact the central race and ask for help?
The central race is well aware of the Animus, and consider them their most potent enemy. Perhaps they consider them unsalvageable. Or perhaps the central race invites the drama of having an ancient enemy that forces them to protect their most valuable assets. I don't pretend to know. But for whatever reason, the central race is not able or willing to assist the Animus in becoming reconnected to the unification force.
So whatever happened to Lucifer and his plan?
According to the Cordium, he's alive and well and completely reintegrated into his species as a member of high standing.
Just so I'm clear, we are talking about Satan, aren't we?
Theologians are left with a tattered tapestry of myth and legend, and from this, they've injected their own interpretations down through time. What we're left with is little more than the fiction of 1,000 voices, but it somehow manages to become known as fact. Satan, as we think of him, never existed. There is no countermeasure to God. God encompasses all dynamics. It has no polarity of itself that is beyond its reach, or personalized outside of itself. The story of Lucifer at a very high level was just described to you. I assume you can see some similarity to the version of the Lucifer rebellion depicted in the Bible, but the correlation, I'm sure you'd admit, is sparse at best. If you watch movies like Star Wars or Star Trek, they imply that extraterrestrials populate every planetary system in the galaxy and beyond. However, it just isn't true. Our planet is an extremely rare combination of animals and organisms. The universe that comprises our physical reality membrane is in fact hostile to life at an extreme level. And yet life somehow managed to emerge on our planet in the black depths of our oceans.
What does this have to do with my question?
Be patient, I'll get to it. I promise.
Okay.
The habitable zones within our universe would be analogous to extracting a drop of water from the Pacific Ocean every cubic mile, and defining it as the only part of the ocean that contained all of the potential conditions to bear microbial life. Then, extracting a single molecule from each of these drops of water, and defining it as the only part of the drop that could sustain multicellular life, and from each of these molecules, extracting a single quantum particle and defining it as the only part of the molecule that could sustain complex, sentient life forms like humans. The genetic library that thrives upon Earth is a form of currency that has no price tag. All I can say is that its value far exceeds anything that human thought could imagine. And with this incredible value, our planet attracts interest from a wide range of extraterrestrial races, And this is as true today as it was 1,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago. Objects of inestimable value and rarity, such as Earth, attract beings from outside our planetary system that desire to control them, which makes Earth an extraordinary object of attraction. It's precisely this attraction that has brought the concepts of evil to our psyche.
I followed you right up to the last sentence and then lost you. How did this attraction bring evil to our consciousness?
Aggressive ETs, seeking to quite literally own Earth, visited our planet approximately 11,000 years ago. These ETs brought their genetics to our native DNA, and in so doing, modified our human DNA, adding a more aggressive, domineering drive to our personalities. This predisposition divided the human species into the conquerors and the conquered.
I don't get it. You're saying that ETs impregnated thousands of our native population with an aggressive gene that brought evil into our consciousness?
These ETs were not so different in physical form than the native humans, and they were treated like gods because of their superior technologies and capabilities. It was considered a great honor to have intercourse with these beings, but only a few were selected.
So how did their DNA become so influential that it literally brought evil into our lives?
One of the yet-to-be-discovered properties of DNA is that it can communicate traits, particularly aggressive traits, without physical interaction.
Explain, please.
There are carrier circuits within the DNA that transmit traits and even forms of intelligence through a reality membrane that is subquantum. It's a tributary ingredient of the unification force that propagates new traits and understandings in the few to the many. It's what enables the transmission of a new insight or potent trait across a spectrum of a species that resonates with the insight or trait, and it does it without physical interaction.
You're saying that a single person could have an idea or trait that is deposited within their DNA, and then their DNA transmits this trait like a broadcast tower and everyone on the planet that's like them is affected? You're saying that a single person could have an idea, or trait that is deposited within their DNA and then their DNA transmits this trait like a broadcast tower, and everyone on the planet that's like them is affected?
Let me clarify some things you said. First, it's not one person. It requires a critical mass of several hundred for a personality trait to transmit, and perhaps only 10 or 20 to transmit a new concept or insight. In any case, one person is not sufficient. This is not an exact science yet, even to the ACO. Secondly, it's not transmitted like a broadcast tower. It's transmitted selectively to resonant DNA, and the effect it has isn't dependent on whether the recipient is like, or even similar to, the donor. It's dependent on the receptivity of their DNA. Some people open their DNA up to new innovations, others don't. This is the critical factor in whether the new trait or idea is successfully transmitted.
Okay, ETs with their aggressive personalities infected humans, and this brought evil tendencies to our race. Why would the central race allow this to happen?
We don't know.
But you said earlier that they would protect our planet with their best technology. Why didn't they protect it thousands of years ago?
This is a mystery. We don't know.
I assume this must be another reason that 15 doesn't want to rely on the Wingmakers for our protection.
He doesn't talk about it, but I'd agree with you.
I'd like to return to the topic of God. And just for the record, I'm well aware that I'm off the subject of the Wingmakers, but I can't resist talking about these things. Okay?
It's fine with me. I'll discuss any topic you choose.
You explained earlier that to you, God is a force, but is it the force?
Do you mean is God plural or singular?
Yes.
God is both.
Both.
God is found everywhere because it's the unification force, but paradoxically, being the unification force it is also unique or singular. Physicists will explain to you that there are four primary forces at play in the universe: strong nuclear, weak nuclear, gravity, and electromagnetic. These forces are actually facets of a singular force, more primal and absolutely causative. Einstein worked nearly 30 years trying to prove this with his unification theory, but never found his answers. No one supposedly has. I can only report that the Labyrinth Group using its LERM technology has discovered this force. And this force possesses an unmistakable consciousness. That is, it is neither chaos nor order. It is both, and flows between the two worlds of chaos and order like a sine wave flows between positive and negative amplitude.
And can our physicists prove or disprove this?
No, our physicists cannot prove or disprove what I say. They're too shackled in specialized theories that are in crisis.
What kind of theories?
Like quantum mechanics, to name one example. Nearly all physicists, regardless of their specialty, would stand before you in all sincerity, and advise you that quantum mechanics is the correct and complete theory underlying our understanding of the universe. But it doesn't honor the consciousness of a particle, and it has no way of detecting the infinitesimal magnetic fields within which these particles reside.
Why?
This is not a layperson's topic, Sarah. I don't know how to explain this in words you'll understand. It has to do with the fact that our physicists in academia lack sophisticated force amplification technology that can detect the extraordinarily tiny magnetic fields that subatomic particles nest within, which in turn creates an interconnected web of thought circuits. These thought circuits taken collectively represent the exterior structure of the unification force, and they permeate the multiverse. The magnetic fields represent the interior of the unification force, and they permeate the formless consciousness.
Okay, I get your point about it not being a layperson's topic. You've completely lost me in the abstract nature of this discussion. I thought we were talking about God, and now I'm not sure what we're talking about.
Keep focused on the primal force. God has decelerated itself to display its physical embodiment in the four known forces I spoke of earlier.
So, this is truly how the universe works, and I should just accept it?
No. I don't want to leave you with the impression that what I've said is the way the multiverse works. If there's one truth I can state unequivocally, it's that my understanding of the multiverse, while constrained with the tools of particle physics, cosmology, and mathematics, is partial at best, and completely inaccurate at worst.
Well, that leaves us essentially nowhere, doesn't it? If what you've said tonight is just partial understanding or complete misjudgment, where does that leave our brightest scientists and theologians? You have all the advantages of advanced technology and alien cosmology, and still you can't explain the universe with any confidence. Even with your proof of God, you claim to know essentially nothing that's absolutely true. How can that be?
No one who's invested in astronomy, cosmology, or physics likes to think that their discipline is misguided by false or incomplete assumptions. But they are. And there's a good reason.
Which is?
Imagine that the observable universe is the middle rung on a ladder of unknown length. Each of the rungs above and below our observable universe represents an order of magnitude beyond our senses. For example, let's say that the rung above the one that represents our observable universe is the outer perimeter of our Milky Way galaxy. Using a telescope we can see the next rung above us, but the rest of the ladder is lost in a thick haze. Looking downward at a microscopic level with an electron microscope we can add another rung below our observable universe, and with a particle accelerator, we can even theorize what the next rung below that might be, but the rest of the ladder trails downward into a thick haze no different than when we try to look up. With all of our technology and theory, we still have no idea how tall the ladder is or even whether the ladder is straight or begins to curve like a double helix. We don't know if perhaps the top end of the ladder curves to such a degree that it actually connects with the bottom end of the ladder. And we don't even know whether there might be additional ladders.
Okay, I think I know where you're going with this. But then why does it always seem that science knows more than they really do?
The largest population of the planet, perhaps 99%, has no experience beyond the middle rung of the ladder. And those that are privileged to observe the next rung above or below by the use of technology, falsely assume, or perhaps hope, that the ladder retains the same form and holds to the same principles. The ACO has observed another rung of this ladder beyond the technology of academia. Nothing more. However, in doing so, we've only become humbled by the depth and breadth of our ignorance. We've learned that the ladder does change. It begins to modify its form and we theorize that its shape is no longer predictable or even stable.
So doesn't that mean that our physics is wrong?
I like the way an obscure writer, by the name of Gustav Necke, put it. Whenever knowledge takes a step forward, God recedes a step backwards. Each rung of the ladder may require a different physics or set of laws and instruments. Is the Neanderthal wrong in the face of the modern human? He was merely a precursor or early prototype. And this is the same as physics or cosmology. It must be understood as a valid prototype that has its purpose in time, but will ultimately be displaced by a new model that encompasses more rungs of the ladder.
It's still hard to imagine how all this technological advantage that the ACO wields could only make clear how little we know about our universe. It doesn't leave much hope for us.
How do you mean that?
Well, it seems to me that if we don't know what we don't know, we're doomed to make assumptions about things that are taken as fact, when in reality, it's just opinion. In this regard, science is no better than religion. Right?
The interesting thing about science is that origins reveal how things work. If you can follow particles to their origins, you can understand how inner space works. If you can follow the cosmic particles, galaxies, quasars, and black holes to their origins, you can understand how outer space works. When you put the two halves together within between space, or the observable universe, you can understand how the whole multiverse works. The problem is that no one has the lens or technology to observe the origins. And this is where theory takes over. The difference between science and religion is that science applies theory while religion applies faith. Both theory and faith, however, fall short of revealing origins. So in this regard, they're similar.
But if what you're saying is true, then we live in a world we don't really understand.
Exactly.
If we don't understand our world, and science and religion are inadequate, where do we turn? I mean, how are we supposed to cope with our ignorance?
The danger of ignorance is only in believing that you're not ignorant. If you know that you lack insight into the inner dimensions of how things work, you know that you have blind spots. You can keep a wary eye open for any advantage that enables a deeper insight or more profound sense of meaning. You have to learn to live with incompleteness and use it as a motivating force rather than a point of desperation or indifference. As far as where do we turn? That's a hard question to answer. It's the reason that all the dramas have become packaged and sold via the media. The media is where most people turn. They flick on their televisions, radios, computers, newspapers, magazines, and even books, and these deliver the packets of information bundled together by the media. The media know very well that people are ignorant enough so that they lack the ability to discern the incompleteness of the information packets they serve to their customers. Information is incomplete, and this drowns our population in ignorance, which enables manipulation.
By whom?
Sarah, no one entity is the master manipulator, if that's what you're asking. It's more like everyone in the media manipulates information and disclosure. It's all part of the drama that causes people to turn to the media for their answers, and citizens are responsible for this state of affairs because they don't demand that their educational centers secure clear, full disclosures of information and distribute it to the public domain.
Are you saying that our schools and universities should be the stewards of this information, and not the media?
In the ideal world, yes. This is how the core team designs their information structures. The educational centers dominate the distribution of information through a collective and well-reasoned system of journalism. The journalists are specialists across the disciplines of theology, the arts and sciences, government, business, and technology. These journalists document the best practices of each and every discipline and share this information through full disclosure. Nothing is left out. The research is meticulous and completely untouched by the political spectrum of special interests.
Okay, being a journalist myself, we've finally hit on a topic I know something about. When I was a beat reporter, I never felt the hand of politics influencing how or what I reported. I know at the national level, particularly reporting in DC, that might not be entirely the case, but the stories we've been talking about the past few nights weren't even on my radar screen. That's the real problem. These stories are completely secreted away. And given that our politicians don't even know about the existence of the ACO and all of the other things affiliated with it, how can you blame the politicians, or the media for that matter?
I didn't intend to blame anyone, really. The system is imperfect. Anyone involved in the system knows that it's larger than life and can't be changed by one person or even one group of people. The media know their limits, and they know their markets. People want to know the truth about the things that affect them in their pocketbook. The regions of cosmology, ETs, the ACO, and things that go bump in the night are considered light reading to the masses, reserved for entertainment, not serious news.
This is anything but light news, and you know it. Why do you sound so cynical?
If I'm cynical about the media, it's not for you to take personally. I'm of a mind that the media will not change significantly until the education system changes significantly and produces students that demand more than news, dramas, sports, and weather.
So our schools should not only produce students with an appetite for cosmology, but they should also produce the news? Pretty tall orders for schools, don't you think?
Perhaps, but it's what's needed before the ACO or any related organization would share its knowledge with the masses.
And why is that?
Academia would absolutely be turned on its head if the ACO stepped forward and provided its research findings, technologies, and evidence of ET interactions. It would be attacked. And it would be a vicious attack. At least that was 15's intractable conclusion. The ACO, therefore, had no other way to bring its findings to the public than through the private sector and the alliances it had with the NSA's Special Projects Laboratory.
Give me an example of something, a technology or discovery, that was first uncovered by the ACO and then exported to the private sector.
The transistor would be a good example.
You're telling me that the ACO invented the transistor?
No, Bell Labs invented the transistor, but the ACO worked with Bell Labs, or more specifically, Mervyn Kelly, who ran its operations in the mid-1950s. Mr. Kelly had attached a rather brilliant physicist to this project by the name of Bill Shockley, who became aware of the outermost edges of the ACO.
How'd that happen?
A little-known fact, Mr. Shockley, working with a friend of his, invented the world's first nuclear reactor. The Defense Department heard about it through Mr. Kelly, and wanted it badly. This was before the Manhattan Project got underway. Mr. Kelly wanted a patent for the discovery, but the government threw up every conceivable roadblock. They kept the whole discovery under complete confidentiality and negotiated to have one of our scientists work with Mr. Shockley in secret.
When was this?
This was happening in 1944 and 1945.
Why did our government squabble about the patents?
They knew Mr. Shockley could play a role in the war, and they wanted to use this as leverage to secure his commitment to help. He was a difficult man to work with, so I was told. He never stepped forward and volunteered to do anything unless he knew it would somehow benefit him. So, our government held the patents up until he would enlist.
And did he?
Yes.
And how did it benefit him?
There was, within our government, a newly formed intelligence agency. It was the forerunner of the NSA. It was known as the General Services Special Projects Laboratory, and to this day, very little is known all about it. The SPL was later folded into the NSA in 1953 as an unacknowledged department, and ultimately the ACO was folded into the SPL as an unacknowledged research laboratory. So, the ACO was 2 levels deep, or what is called Blackroot.
What was the motivation for all the security? The war?
It may surprise you, but the war wasn't of great concern to the forces that the ACO were dealing with. The concern was ETs and who would be able to first utilize their technology in military applications. In the early 1940s, UFO sightings were quite common, even more so than today. And our government was convinced that these sightings were real and that they were indeed off-planetary forces. They wanted 2 things: steal the technology from downed spacecraft, or establish an alliance. They weren't too particular about which way it happened.
But how did all of this pertain to Shockley?
I got off track a bit. Mr. Shockley was introduced to the SPL and was made privy to many of the secret initiatives of the SPL. If not for his personality traits, he would have been recruited to join the SPL. He was that brilliant. Anyway, he was given access to some of the research in field effect transistors that was underway within the SPL. This was before the Bell Labs discovery of the joint transistor, which was made by colleagues of Mr. Shockley. Mr. Shockley was allowed to utilize some of the research within the SPL to create his own version of the field effect transistor and become widely known as its inventor. This was done in exchange for his cooperation in helping Army and Navy strategic operations during the war. He was aware of the SPL and knew part of their agenda, And I was told that he wanted to join the SPL after the war because of its superior laboratories, but again, his personality traits prevented his admission.
So, Bell Labs receives the patent for the transistor in exchange for Shockley's assistance with the war. What exactly did he do that was so important?
I don't know for certain, but in general, his role was helping to optimize weapons deployment.
What was the role of the NSA during all of this?
The NSA wasn't in existence until November 1952. During this time, the SPL and ACO were the two most advanced, secretive labs in existence. And they each had only one private sector lab they worked with, Bell Labs. And this is because Mr. Kelly was a friend with the executive director of the SPL.
So what was the relationship between the SPL and ACO?
You mean in the 1940s?
First, how far back does it go?
The SPL was formed in 1938. There was a strong development, particularly throughout Europe, in fission energy. The SPL was initially conceived to examine fission as an alternative energy source as well as its possible military applications.
Why was it kept so secret?
In the late 1930s there was significant political unrest in Europe, and the US wasn't sure whom it could trust. It had a notion that fission was the answer to superior technical warfare, and didn't want to share it unwittingly. It was also alarmed at some of the sudden advances that were taking place in the European physics community, and felt it needed to concentrate some of its best resources to equip a world-class laboratory, and staff it with some of the best minds of the planet.
How could the best minds of the planet suddenly be plucked up by the US government and not be noticed by the scientific community? I mean, how do you keep this a secret?
They didn't take established leaders in the field of physics. They sought out the young, budding geniuses that were still relatively unknown, but under the right guidance and with the best available technology, could produce something extraordinary.
Like the transistor?
Like the transistor.
So if the SPL was established in 1938, when did the ACO come into existence?
It was established in 1940, shortly after the SPL was organized.
Why?
First, in part, it was because management within the SPL feared discovery by Congress. So they decided to construct Blackroot, which was the code name of the ACO, in order to build a laboratory that was untouchable by political forces or the media. Second, they didn't want the research agenda of the SPL competing with ETSUs. When all of this first occurred, ETs and UFOs were still a subject of great debate within the SPL. Most of the SPL leaders didn't believe in them. There was no hard evidence. But when the first spacecraft was found intact, it changed the minds of everyone within the SPL, and it was decided that a separate research agenda needed to be developed, and that it was the more urgent and secretive of the two labs. So, Blackroot, or the ACO as it became known later, was established behind the SPL at a deeper level of secrecy. It was unacknowledged 2 levels deep.
Were you referring to the Roswell Incident just then? About the recovered spacecraft?
No. This was an abandoned spacecraft found in waters off the coast of Florida in 1940.
It was just abandoned? Who found it?
As the story goes, a recreational diver found it in waters about 60 feet deep. It was perfectly preserved.
Whatever happened to the diver?
It was an anonymous tip given to the Navy. The person who discovered it was never found. However, we later learned that the discovery was a staged event.
A staged event?
Meaning that the discovery was orchestrated by the core team.
So this was a core team spacecraft left behind to be discovered by the Navy?
It's how they chose to make first contact.
By leaving behind one of their spacecraft in the ocean, and then calling our Navy and telling them where to find it? Shit, this is strange.
Yes, but it took 3 calls to get someone to investigate according to the log entries.
Okay. So this is how the ACO came about. When did you get involved?
In 1956, my father discovered a damaged spacecraft in the jungles of Bolivia during a hunting trip. It was a triangular vessel about 70 meters from end to end, nearly equilateral. It included 26 crew. All dead.
Core team?
No, this craft was later confirmed as a Zeta ship. It was on a scouting mission similar to my father hunting for animals. Unfortunately, it malfunctioned in flight during an electrical storm. My father was an electronics dealer, mostly for the Bolivian military.
I know you told me this story before. but please repeat yourself for the sake of the record.
My father recovered a specific technology from the ship, and then contacted a military official within the Bolivian government that was a trusted friend. Initially, my father was interested in selling the craft to the Bolivian military, but it quickly became a concern of the US military, specifically the SPL. A director from the SPL met with my father, ascertained the ship's location, and performed a complete salvage operation in the span of 3 days. This was done in exchange for US citizenship and a role within the SPL for my father.
Why did your father negotiate for this instead of money?
He knew it was the only way to preserve my life and his. He retained control of a navigational technology that was aboard the ship, and turned everything else over to the SPL.
And what about the Bolivian government?
They were handsomely paid.
That's it?
In the 7 years between 1952 and 1959, 6 additional spacecraft were found under similar circumstances as in the case of my father. Only one of these was found in US territory. The other 5 were willingly handed over to our military in exchange for money.
I take it these countries didn't want to deal with the political implications?
But they also wanted the money and a friendly alignment with the US military. They saw future benefits in the form of shared technologies, military protection, loans, and many other intangible benefits. In short, it was smart politics. Besides, no other country, outside of the Soviet Union, had any laboratories like the ACO. What would they do with these spacecrafts?
Your father and you end up in the United States. What qualified him for admission into the SPL and what did he do there?
My father was not simply a salesman to the Bolivian government. He was an electronics expert with the equivalent of an advanced electrical engineering degree. He had several patents to his credit, but was considered something of a dreamer and a lost soul, I suppose.
Is he still alive?
No.
I'm sorry. What about the rest of your family? Was it just you and your father that came to America?
I was an only child. My mother died shortly after I was born. I was only 4 years old when we came to the States. I really don't have strong memories of my home in Sorata.
Where's Sorata?
North of La Paz, on the east end of Lake Titicaca.
Maybe I've watched too many episodes of the X-Files, but it seems a little hard to believe that your father could negotiate a job and US citizenship with the SPL. Can you explain how he did that?
He asked. It wasn't such a hard thing. Here's a man that speaks perfect English, knows electronics, and has some political clout. More importantly, he led the SPL to a very important discovery, worth billions of dollars in research and development. And, my father was smart enough to photograph the craft and secure electronic components that pertained to navigation. He had these carefully secured with instructions for their distribution should anything befall him or me.
Don't take this the wrong way, but didn't you say that only young geniuses were hired into the ACO? I assume your father didn't qualify.
No. He wasn't a genius. But he was smart enough to add value to some of the reverse engineering experiments that were ongoing within the ACO, especially those that pertained to semiconductors.
And all this was happening in the mid-50s?
Yes.
Was 15 there at the time?
No. He joined the ACO in the spring of 1958.
So he knew your father?
My father, believe it or not, became a high-level director of the ACO toward the latter part of his tenure, thanks largely to 15, who took an immediate liking to my father. Remember, 15 is Spanish. My father knew 15 as well as anyone, and had the utmost respect for him.
Was your father part of the Labyrinth Group?
Yes.
When did you find out about the Labyrinth Group and its mission?
15 introduced me to it in a meeting I'll never forget.
What time was this?
September 18, 1989.
What happened?
15 showed me a suite of technologies that had been part of a TTP with the core team. He explained it activated parts of the brain that fused the unconscious data stream with the conscious. It enabled a much more potent flow of data to be captured by the conscious mind.
Can you explain how it works?
I'll do my best, but it's a technical explanation. I don't know any other way to do it.
Try. I'll signal when I'm lost.
There's a part of the brain known as thalamocortical system. The core team technology activated this specific section of the brain, inducing a small functional cluster within this system to expand the higher order consciousness. These are the neural coordinates of consciousness, pertaining to higher order reasoning, which is very useful to scientific inquiry, mathematics, and general problem solving. Yes?
I'm not totally lost. But what's the role of this technology to the Labyrinth Group?
When 15 first became acquainted with the core TTP, he was the first to use this technology on his own brain.
Yes, I remember now. He got the vision of BST shortly afterwards. Right?
Correct.
And this was why he established the Labyrinth Group, to pursue the development of BST. Right?
Yes.
So, everyone who was handpicked by 15 got to use this core TM technology, and everyone got smarter as a result. And no one outside the Labyrinth Group suspected that the Labyrinth Group existed?
No one to my knowledge.
Okay, back to your story with 15. What happened?
Everyone who knew anything about 15 knew he was intensely interested in time travel, but I had no idea as to the degree of his intensity until that day. He explained the physics behind his BST plan and how the core team played a vital role in its development. He wanted to reassign me to a new project that was related to BST development, and when he explained the nature of the project, I shook my head in disbelief that he felt I could do the job.
What was it?
It was a project that involved designing and developing an advanced neuronal selection technology for the human brain, a subject that I knew very little about. I raised this objection, but 15 explained that no one else did either, so it was just as well that I undertook the research. And then he casually explained the core team technology for brain enhancement. This was when he told me how all personnel with the security clearance of 12 were invited to undergo the process.
I assume everyone accepted the invitation.
It's a safe assumption, although there are some drawbacks to the technology.
Like?
The information capacity of the conscious mind is very limited. When you intensify the connection between the conscious and unconscious, the conscious mind rejects the data stream's breadth of information and tends to become observational of the alternative states of consciousness. In other words, the brain enhancement process triggers a rapid and fluid shifting between states of consciousness, not unlike a slideshow in fast motion with each slide representing a different state of consciousness.
I think I follow you. But isn't it worth it if you can control this side effect?
I thought so, as did everyone else. There were some that were more affected by this than others, and typically it only lasted for a few weeks until the higher mind began to integrate this into its dynamic core.
Okay, enough about the brain. I'd like to return to the topic of the Labyrinth Group. You mentioned in the first interview that this is the most secret of all the organizations on the planet, even though it's one of the most influential. How does it operate in secrecy and yet exert its influence?
The Labyrinth Group is a subset of the ACO that's absolutely secret. Its main purpose was to create a staging organization for the pure state technologies that were part of the TTPs that 15 negotiated with the Zetas and Core Team. 15 didn't want these technologies within the ACO where they were within striking distance of the SPL and potentially the NSA. He wanted to be able to review, analyze, and synthesize these new technologies before he figured out how to dilute them into less powerful technologies that could be exported to the SPL or the private syndicates we worked with. We used the best security technologies in existence. By that, I mean that we could secure our technologies from any hostile force. This enabled the Labyrinth Group personnel to focus on applications of these pure state technologies for the advancement of our BST agenda. Our influence is not understood by anyone because we've managed to release these diluted technologies into behind-the-scenes technologies that are used by our military, the NSA, DARPA, and private syndicates of our own choosing.
I thought you said you even work with private industry?
The Labyrinth Group doesn't work directly with the private sector. But some of our technologies filter into the private sector.
Like the transistor?
No. Actually the field effect transistor was more the development of the SPL.
Then give me an example of something more recent that involved the Labyrinth Group and the private sector. Something I might be aware of.
I can't think of anything that would be known to you at this time. Our technologies don't appear on the cover of Newsweek or Time.
I just want to get some information that I can validate later. The transistor story, while interesting, doesn't give me anything I can follow up on. I doubt Shock is still alive. Is he?
First of all, if he were alive, He'd never divulged the influence of the SPL in his research. Second, he died about 8 years ago.
So what can you share with me that corroborates even to a tiny degree that the Labyrinth Group might exist?
Nothing. There's nothing you could do to trace things back to the Labyrinth Group. I can't stress it enough. Our ways of filtering technologies into the private sector are extremely subtle.
Okay, then. Just give me an example.
The Labyrinth Group developed a computer system, which we call ZEMI. Part of the unique characteristics of ZEMI is that its information structure is based on a new form of mathematics for information storage, recombinant encryption, and data compression. It was a mathematics that provided quantum improvements in each of these areas. And we shared it with scientists involved in the design of the MiG-29.
Russia? Are you saying the Labyrinth Group works with the Russian government?
No, we never worked with governments directly. In this case, we worked with the Phasotron Research and Production Company in Moscow. We supplied them with an assortment of algorithms, which they in turn adapted for use within their information and fire control radar systems aboard the MiG-29. These same algorithms were discovered by American interests and are now being adapted for use in broadband delivery systems for the global market.
Who's the American interest? Can you give me names?
It's not a well-known company, but they go under the name of Omnigon, based in San Diego.
And Omnigon has this technology, which was originally developed by the Labyrinth Group for computer storage, and now they're using it to build broadband delivery systems. In layperson's terms, can you tell me what these networks will do?
Assuming they use this technology appropriately, it'll enable Omnigon to embed a significant amount of functionality in the switches of the ATM network and not rely on server-side solutions, which will increase the speed and custom functionality of a network.
By my definition, that wasn't in layperson terms. But it doesn't matter. Did the Labyrinth Group create this technology or reverse engineer it from ET sources?
A little of both, actually. They were created within the Labyrinth Group, but some of the initial thinking came from the Zitters, which was reverse engineered from one of their spacecraft.
How did the organization in Russia get this technology from the Labyrinth Group?
15 knew one of the senior scientists at Phasotron and presented him with the idea. It was a friendly gesture, which he believed would later be useful in recruiting this scientist. This method of sharing creates loyalty, and it can be done in such a skillful way that the recipient of the idea can believe it was their idea and not simply given to them.
But you must track these technologies, or how else would you know it ended up in Omnigon's hands?
We have operatives from the intelligence community who feed us information. They're essentially moles that live within the major government research labs and the military-industrial complex. In this case, one of our operatives at General Dynamics brought this to our attention. We even use our remote viewing technology to track some of our more advanced technologies that we've placed within major syndicates.
Maybe we should leave off there. I know you'd prefer to keep these sessions brief, although I'm very tempted to plunge into this topic of syndicates. Is there anything you'd like to add before we call it a night?
No, not really. I think we covered a lot of information tonight about my personal philosophy. And for what it's worth, I'd like to remind you that it was my philosophy. I'm not trying to press it on anyone. And I'm certainly not trying to preach a particular message or lifestyle. I would hope that in our next session, with your help, we could concentrate on the Wingmakers and perhaps minimize my personal views on cosmology and the like.
I'll try, but I can't make any promises. I had a complete list of questions to ask you tonight about the Wingmakers. But somewhere along the way I thought it would be interesting to better understand how you think. I'll try my best tomorrow night to keep on the subject of the Wingmakers. Do you have any suggestions?
I think the artifacts are extremely interesting, so I'd recommend that we focus on that topic.
I'll do my best. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Sarah. Thank you as well.
End of session 3.